Hey everybody, Hoosier Jedi here with another review for you. This time I'm talking about episode 1 of season 2 of Ultimate Spider-Man called The Lizard. First of all, a quick apology for this review going up a few days later than it normally would. I honestly thought this episode was going to air next week, and I just stumbled across the fact that it was actually already out by coincidence. So, yeah, sorry about that, folks. I kind of dropped the ball on that. But anyway, let's get right into it. And we're picking up an undetermined amount of time since the last episode, but enough time has passed so that the amazing friends have settled into Peter's home. And this is very reminiscent. I mean, this is really pretty much a page right out of the Ultimate Spider-Man comics, except it was the Human Torch and Iceman who ended up living with Ultimate Peter Parker. Here, it's of course, the Amazing Friends, but it still works. The idea of kind of Aunt May's place being sort of this group home for superpowered teenagers, I always thought was actually a really great idea, and one that I kind of wish had been expanded on a little bit more. I honestly, right about the time that started happening, is sort of when I basically just stopped reading the Ultimate Spider-Man comics for various reasons, although I did kind of keep an eye on it. But like I said, this does really hold the potential for some really nice storytelling. I have to admit, I did get a big kick out of Peter even referring to the Amazing Friends as his amazing family. This is a very major shift in the dynamic between the characters, and it's one that's in all likelihood really going to address one of my major criticisms of last season, where we really knew nothing about the Amazing Friends, their lives beyond being operatives of S.H.I.E.L.D., that they had no real, anything beyond their jobs. There really wasn't that much to them. They were, just co-workers, really. Here we have a chance to really kind of get to know them on a more emotional and human level. And I will say though, one thing about the way they did last season, another one of my constant complaints was the way they just completely showed complete and utter disregard for Peter's secret identity. Well, finding out that they didn't really have homes or families, that shed quite a bit of insight onto that. And I can't help but wonder if now that they're in the situation, living with Peter, if they aren't themselves going to have to start taking their secret identities more seriously. Now, I certainly hope that's the case, because it would be, another way in which Peter could serve as a mentor to the Amazing Friends, which is, he's honestly been sort of little. Okay, it's actually not Peter's fault. I'm going to have to put this one on the writers, really. It's been very spotty on just exactly us seeing Peter acting as a real mentor to the rest of the Amazing Friends. And honestly, I kind of hope we just learn what the deal with these guys not having families is. I know that in the comics, for example, Ava had an older brother, Hector Ayala, who was White Tiger before her. So I'd really kind of like to know more about how these guys got their powers, what their deal is. Now, granted, I'm familiar with the origin of these characters in the comics, well, with Nova being something of an exception, as the Sam Alexander version of the character was created specifically for the show, but of course I'm familiar with the Richard Rider version of Nova's origin. So, yeah, that's something I'm certainly hoping we do get into this season. Now, I actually was reading an interview with some of the folks who were behind this series, and one of the things that they did mention, and I'm not going to really consider this a spoiler, is that we are going to get to see another one of my kind of complaints about last season addressed, is that we're going to be seeing more classic Spider-Man villains. And this episode is an example of that, of course. We are introduced to longtime Spider-Man foe, the Lizard. I'll talk about him in just a minute. Another thing that they mentioned is that we'll be seeing a lot more of the S.H.I.E.L.D. tech. And honestly, this isn't really something I'm terribly enthusiastic about. Now, I don't mind Spider-Man pulling out a few new tricks with his webbing. The things he can do with his webbing has indeed grown over the years. And it just sort of makes sense that Peter would, in that regard, learn new things as time went by. But Spider-Man, he's not somebody like Iron Man to me. Somebody who is very much a technological hero. At the end of the day, Spider-Man is a guy who has superpowers, who has a few little tech gadgets like his web shooters and his spider tracers that help him out a little bit, that give him a small edge. So, but I think putting too much tech in Spidey's hands, it makes sense, of course, with him working as an agent of S.H.I.E.L.D., but it just, to me, seems like a step away from what Spider-Man traditionally is. But anyway, let's continue on here. Talking about Curt Connors. Well, one thing that I did like is Peter kind of specifically mentioning that he sees Curt as a mentor. And I think this sort of touches a little bit upon what he had going on with Iron Man in the first season. Now that only really got a very minor amount of play. Of course, there was a great deal more of Tony acting as mentor to Peter in the comics, but here Peter connecting with a S.H.I.E.L.D. agent actually makes much more sense. Iron Man has his own Iron Man stuff going on. He has his Tony Stark stuff going on. I think it's safe to say that the Avengers are in the works for the future. And if you've seen some of the previews for this season, well. But anyway, now Curt Connors what's going on with him is a little bit different than what's traditionally in the comics, and I have some mixed feelings about this. My main thing is that they make what I think is actually a really interesting and very smart change, and this is that Curt ultimately injects himself with the lizard formula so that he can gain the power to save Spider-Man from the laser. Now, one of the traditions in the Spider-Man comics is that so many of his villains and enemies are people that he has an emotional connection to. Like Venom, Eddie Brock was his co-worker / rival. Norman Osborn and Harry Osborn both became the Green Goblin. And the list does go on and on. But anyway, here taking that and turning into somebody, having the lizard be someone that Peter previously has an emotional connection to is good. But the idea that he did this in order to save Peter's life, that's what I think is important. But what bothers me about the way it's presented here is that Peter doesn't really seem to feel much guilt. He does not seem to see himself as being, Doc Connors did this to himself in order to save my life. Now, I understand that this is, of course, a show that's airing on Disney. They're keeping it much, much lighter. But, guilt is just such an integral aspect of Spider-Man's and Peter Parker's character. And just to sort of not really see it even acknowledged, even briefly, it just doesn't sit quite well with me. Now, it's not that Peter isn't upset by the situation, and it's not that he doesn't feel responsibility. But it's more, as he puts it, he sees Connors as a member of his extended S.H.I.E.L.D. family and his mentor whom he wants to help and protect. But he doesn't seem to have that personal, this happened because I screwed up kind of guilt, kind of emotional turmoil going on that I think he should have. Now, again, I have to reiterate, I understand this is basically, at the end of the day, a show aimed at like 9-year-old kids, so they're not going to get too heavy on the angst. But, just a line or two acknowledging that Peter feels some level of guilt for what happened, I think that really would go a long way to keeping him more firmly in the Spider-Man tradition. Let's put it that way. Let me see here. Yes, I really do have to say that one thing that I got a big kick out of was the nods to both Challenge of the Super Friends and the old Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends cartoon shows from the late 70s and the early 80s. Those were really well done. I wasn't really so much of a fan of Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, but Super Friends does have a certain place in my heart, even after all these years, and even as silly as it was. And just hearing those old Super Friends sound effects, oh man, does that take me back to being like 5 years old and watching cartoons in front of my TV in my parents' living room. I mean, yeah, you really can't put a price on those little moments. Oh, and speaking of nods to old stuff, the weird little spider chase video game thing where Stan Lee pops up to yell at them, he even goes, "Hey, I'm walking here." Now, this is, of course, a reference to the very famous film Midnight Cowboy. And if you're actually familiar with what Midnight Cowboy is about, it's more than a little surprising that they got away with putting a reference to it in a kids' cartoon show. And well, not to be too blunt about it, but one of the two main characters in Midnight Cowboy is a gay prostitute. Let's put it that way. So yeah, I'm a little surprised they got away with that. But then again, it was just sort of a vague allusion to a very popular award-winning film. So maybe I'm just not cutting the censors. Now maybe I'm not giving the censors enough credit for being reasonable human beings. Now, action-wise, some really nice fights this episode. Some, really entertaining throwdowns between Spider-Man and Doc Ock and the Lizard. But at the end of the day, I have to say that characterization-wise, this episode, it felt a little light. Now, I can't really complain about that too much. This is the show coming back after several months. You really want to make sure that the kids are going to tune in for the rest of the season. So, throw out a really nice action-packed episode. Don't, beat them over the head with too much information. Let everybody settle back in. And then after you get the train, basically once you get the train out of the station, then you can start adding stuff. And I have a feeling that's what was going on here. And from a more business side of things, it does make perfect sense. Now, I'm not saying that this is a bad episode by any means. It's just, in terms of actual characterization and story, not as strong as I think it could have been. Now, just let me glance at my notes again real quick. Yeah, one other thing that I wanted to give a little talk about briefly was I like how this episode does take some time to acknowledge that when Peter develops the cure, we see him using his skills in biochemistry. Now, I believe I've said in my previous reviews that at the end of the day, while Peter's a very talented guy, knows a lot about stuff about science, it is ultimately biochemistry that is where he really has his genius. That's what allows him to develop his web fluid and all this other fun stuff. So I do like that. I do like that they are showing him to be capable of doing these, comic book super sciencey sort of things. And with that, folks, that's all that I really have for you this episode. Again, this episode, in terms of crunch, shall we say, is a bit on the light side. But still, it was a fun episode. I had the feeling we're in for a much improved second season of this show, and I'm definitely looking forward to some more. And with that said, folks, as always, please comment, rate, and subscribe. And of course, you can follow me on Twitter at Hoosier Jedi. Until next time, take care and have a good one.